Hi, I'm Don McDonald from the Institute of Gerontology at Wayne State University, and I'd like to welcome you to a series of educational videos created to help you on your caregiving journey, whether as a professional or a home-based caregiver. These videos were made possible by a grant called Functional Aging and Mindfulness for Seniors. Today, we are doing sensory changes in dementia. Our presenter is Andi Chapman, who is a well-seasoned RN in both hospital, home care, and hospice. Please give a warm welcome to Andi Chapman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our topic today of sensory changes and dementia care. Caregiving when we're dealing with someone with dementia can be an extremely challenging proposition. And I understand that because we're humans, and dementia is something that sometimes we can't see, but think about sensory changes. This is also something that we can't see sometimes, but we can definitely respond to it emotionally. And, sometimes people are going to push our buttons, just like we push other people's buttons. And the whole thing is we want to learn how we can do better when we have sensory changes and dealing with dementia at the same time. We certainly can overcome some of these challenges. It just takes a little bit of effort, perhaps more on our part, in learning how to maybe approach this individual or keep the individual entertained. Let's face it, if you can't do anything, you get bored and you're going to get into trouble, or at least I know I would. And so we want to make sure that we have some tools that are available for you. So sensory changes can mask dementia. And that is really one of those things that will push our buttons. Is it the dementia that is making things difficult for us? Or is it the sensory change that we can't see that's making things more difficult? Are they having more problems with their vision or their hearing? And is our approach actually causing part of that problem? So all of this rolled into one. Let's think about this. What if it were you? And I want to ask you a few questions. If you were alone and somebody approached you and touched you from behind, how would you respond? If you were moved without warning, how would you feel? If you were in a strange place and you were trying to find your way out or find your way to the toilet, how would you be? If you couldn't find that, that would be very frustrating. And then let's go on about talking to people. If someone is talking with you and you can't hear everything that they're saying, you're going to misinterpret some things. And, quite frankly, we don't want to admit sometimes that we can't hear. So is it the dementia or is it the sensory loss? And add into that, sometimes some of our caregivers have an accent that maybe we're not used to, or they talk too fast. So those are some things that can actually cause some issues for us in dementia care. So how would your life look if that were you? And these are things that we have to really deeply consider. So what do you know about yourself when you're tired? Do you get grumpy when you're tired and somebody asks you to do one more thing? Or you're trying to concentrate on something and you're tired and you can't quite get it? About hungry? We joke about, the hangry man, but that does happen. It changes the way our brain works a little bit. And if you have some dementia, you're going to have even more issues when it is hunger or thirst. How about our emotional status when we're sad or we're angry? Or if there's too much confusion going on, it adds to our confusion. So these are things that happen to us, but if you have dementia, it can make things a whole lot worse. And then we think about the COVID brain too. We've got long COVID. We have people that have dementia that were impacted by COVID, by isolation and the mask wearing. All of that was a very difficult time. And because of the isolation, some people actually got a little bit worse as far as their cognitive impairment went. So lots of things that were going on for you, but it also goes on for them. And in dementia land, they are trying very hard to make sense of events. And sometimes they're doing that multiple times every single day. So imagine what it's like for them. Put yourself in their shoes. And sometimes we can look at it, by coming at it in that direction, we can actually do a lot better because we have a little bit more compassion and understanding for this individual. Now, we know that as we age, we're going to have age-related sensory issues. We have eye issues, we have hearing issues. Sometimes we have touch issues, and we're going to cover that in a little bit. But we do have these sensory changes as we age. And it's perfectly normal. But when you have dementia on top of that, it really compounds the issue. And so it's going to make communication much harder. It's going to make processing that information much harder. And it makes them very, very dependent on people because it's a fearful world that they're living in. And so we want to do the very best we can. So let's talk about how we can understand what's going on with these age-related changes and add dementia into this as well. Because most often, when you think about somebody that is in the aging process and also have dementia, they are going to have a little bit more problems because they have dual sensory loss. And so when we're thinking about this, dementia with sensory loss, it's going to compound not only the problems, but the challenges that we face. So we're going to talk about sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. But let's talk for a second about something that nobody wants to talk about or embarrassed to talk about, and that's sexuality. Usually, when someone has dementia, there is a declined interest in sex and sexual behaviors won't be as pronounced. But there are also some individuals that have a profound interest in it. And that can make things very difficult because we have someone who is a little bit more aggressive, perhaps. But why does sexuality still occur? Well, because they're still alive, because they are still human. And there are things that we have to understand about sexuality. Sometimes it's not that they want to have sexual relations, it's that they just want to be close to you. And one of the things that we forget to do sometimes is to touch with tenderness and compassion. And when we're thinking about caregivers that maybe are in a work setting, obviously they don't want to do anything that's going to excite someone sexually. But when they're doing perhaps cleaning of the body and giving a bath, that can give a little bit of a problem because it feels good and we know it feels good. They're still alive and they can still have those sensations, but it's how we handle it. In a care setting such as that, it would be, to be a little bit firm and say, we're not here for this. And if you need some time, I'll come back later. So they can handle it professionally. But we're talking about caregivers, you at home right now, remembering that they still need that closeness. You need that closeness too. There's that disconnect when we have that cognitive impairment, and we really need to be a little bit closer. They could get restless, and sometimes if they're bored or they're restless, that might be something that's on their mind. How about doing some exercise with these individuals? Maybe they need toileting, or perhaps they're having a problem with the way their clothes are fitting. And so it looks like they're trying to touch themselves and that sort of thing, when actually they're just trying to get comfortable. But they just might miss a need. We might miss a need that they're having. So we have to open up our eyes to that as well. Does it mean that you cannot have a comfortable sexual relationship with your loved one? No, doesn't mean that at all. You can certainly do that, but you both have to be willing, obviously. But sexuality, again, that's something that we don't talk about, but it does happen. It's one of those things that, like I said, often diminishes when we have dementia, but there are some types of dementia where it actually comes to the forefront, and that's your frontotemporal dementia. They can be very hypersexual. So anyway, now we're going to talk about the other things: sight, smelling, taste, touch, and hearing. There is a difference between what is going on with them in their head and what we see. Theirs might be a reality that's different from ours, and which sense is being impacted, to which degree of cognitive impairment are we seeing. Trying to see the world from their viewpoint, their vantage point, might be very, very helpful. So for instance, if somebody is bored, they might go around and start picking things up or examining their hearing aid because, you know, this is there and nobody's there keeping them busy. They might actually go in and try to do something that they hadn't been doing before, cooking perhaps. So they're going to find things to do. It is important that we give them things to do. They might be looking for attention, and some people are going to look for attention in any way they can get it. And sometimes it's that bad behavior that is going to get them that reward of getting your attention. So again, remind yourself that their behavior has meaning. What does it mean for that individual? They may wind up avoiding things, not because they're being antisocial, but because it's too stimulating for them, too overstimulating for their hearing or some of other senses. And then reward, again, that goes back to what it is that they're looking for. Everybody wants a reward of some kind. We are human beings. That validation is very, very important. So sometimes just sitting with them, touching their hand, just being there is enough reward because they feel very lonely and very isolated. So what can we change to make this behavior seem to make sense? We're going to help give you some of those tools. So looking at sight, again, we have normal aging. Usually people over 65 are going to have some kind of issue going on with their eyes. I had really, really good vision for a long time, and now I wear glasses. And you want to be very, very grateful that we have glasses, because if I didn't have them, I couldn't drive. And you would be very grateful that I had my glasses on if you were on the road. But our visual center actually changes when we have dementia. It can create a very distinct difference in not only what they see, but how they see. For example, their depth perception is really off. They might only be able to see 35 or 38 inches in depth. And beyond that, everything is kind of murky or cloudy. And this is where we have problems with going between light spaces and dark spaces on the floor. It can act or feel like they're falling into a hole if they see this dark area. They are going to have a greater fall risk because they can't see very well. They have disorientation because of being in a different place. And so this is where we want to be very cognizant of how we place furniture and what they've gotten used to, because like a person who is that doesn't have cognitive impairment, they might actually be able to move around their house quite well if things are in an area where they've learned that pattern. Well, sometimes persons with dementias can also do that. They have problems with spatial awareness as well. And they might go reach for a glass of water or something and wind up spilling it. Well, it's just water, it's just milk or something. But, you know, we tend to think that they're just being careless. They're really not being careless. Sometimes they actually can't see where they're going with this, or their depth perception or spatial expression is bothered or hampered. You're going to see this person have a lot more dependence on you, and they are going to misidentify different things that they're going to see. So a person with dementia might actually be very confused by a coat hanging up and think that somebody is there. Looks like a hallucination perhaps to us, but it's actually a visual distortion that they're having. And so they may be talking to that code, just like they talk to the television set, because sometimes that person on the TV sounds like they're talking to them. They can see them move, they're looking at them. It's not that they're hallucinating, they're just reacting to what's happening there with them. But sight problems can also be an issue because their visual field is shrinking. It's becoming narrower, it's becoming more focused, and eventually it gets to the point where they really can't see a whole lot. So it's very important with a person who has dementia and has some sight issues as well. And remember that all these things, the cataracts, normal aging, all of this is going to compound the problem that we have with dementia. So it's going to make things much worse. And we want to make sure that we're approaching this person from the front so that they can see us come in. I asked earlier, how would you feel if somebody came up behind you and touched you and you didn't know that they were there? Another problem with all of this is that once we stimulate that fight or flight response, it takes the person with dementia a whole lot longer to calm down. And so we want to make sure we approach from the front. We tell them if we're going to be moving something or where something is placed on a tray. We talk in a normal tone of voice. It always amazes me when somebody has sight issues and they're sitting there with their cane and people go up and they, hi, how are you today? So they talk a little bit louder. Well, one gentleman actually set someone in their place and he said, I am blind, I am not deaf. So remember to talk to them in a normal tone of voice if they have normal hearing, obviously. We want to make sure that we refrain from words that they can't connect with, like saying, well, it's over there. We need to be more specific. It's to your right, move your arm about 3 inches or whatever, be more descriptive because this is going to help them. But when we use words like look or see, or just general words like it's over there or it's here, they can't connect to that sometimes. So what did the left eye say to the right eye? This is a cheesy joke. You're going to tell it to your children and your grandchildren, and they're just going to roll their eyes. I can hear it happening now. But what did the left eye say to the right eye? Between us, something smells. Yep, we're going to talk about the sense of smell. And that's actually kind of interesting because as this brain is going through these changes and we have atrophy of the brain, it's going to impact every person with dementia in pretty much the same way, but maybe at a different pace in different parts of the brain, depending on what part is being impacted the most at that time. But the areas of the brain that change with things with sense of smell and taste, this is really going to impact not only what they smell and their safety sometimes, but it's also going to impact nutrition. So let's talk about that. Smell, the sense of smell is usually, often, I should say, not usually, but often, is one of the first senses to be impacted by Alzheimer's disease. And sadly, it goes undetected. If they don't know that they can't smell something, they're not going to tell you, hey, I can't smell that. They might tell you if you're cooking something and they're early in the cognitive decline, they might be able to relate to the fact that you're maybe cooking a steak on the grill, but they can't smell it. And then they might tell you that they can't smell something. But we have over 10 million olfactory cells, those scent smells that go into our nose, the top of our mouth, into the throat, and up into our brain. And all of this is going to be impacted by this disease. There is something called phantosmia. Why I can't say that, I don't know. I get all messed up every time. But what this is oftentimes smelling something that isn't there. Now, I did some research and they said that when COVID was coming around, that this was not a reported finding. However, I can tell you this. I have had several people, and I experienced it myself, that before I came down with a diagnosable COVID, which I've had twice, could smell cigarette smoke and nobody was around. So that is phantosmia. And it can happen even if you're not getting COVID or some other thing, but it can happen if there is perhaps a possible infection in the nose. And so we want to check those things out. But that will definitely impact your sense of smell, and it will impact your sense of taste. But sight and smell, visual and our sense of smell, are so linked to taste. It's just incredible. When I do presentations for groups, I oftentimes will have someone come up and I blindfold them and put nose plugs on them and put a piece of candy in their mouth, and they have to identify the flavor. And oftentimes they'll guess. And so then I say, well, take off the blindfold. Does that help? No, it doesn't help at all. How about taking off the nose plug? Well, once you get that air that goes through, now it helps to stimulate all of those olfactory cells, and they can actually taste the piece of candy that's in their mouth. And oftentimes, more often than not, can identify properly the taste that they're having. So we know that taste is very, very important. If you don't have good taste buds going, it's going to impact your nutrition because you don't feel like eating. Now think about how you feel when you have a cold. If you have a cold, your nose is really stuffed, it's like nothing is going to be impacting you at all. Nothing sounds good. You can't taste it even if you eat it. And so this has been a way that maybe we can identify or relate to, rather, our loved one who has some dementia and has some taste issues, sight and smell issues that go along with that. When someone with dementia has this problem going on, they actually have a tendency to overbalance the diet in what actually tastes good. So we're looking at things that are very, very sweet or very, very sour. All of these things can actually change as well. And so we can't taste as well as we could, or at all sometimes. And so we're going to compensate in whatever happens. So visually, what we want to do is to make sure that our plate looks good. Even if you have a weakened sense of smell or taste, if it's visually attractive, appealing to the eye, it may actually stimulate that brain, and they may want to eat more. And so your foods that are high in the phytonutrients are going to have bright, vivid colors. And these are very important because the more vivid the color, oftentimes the more nutritious and more fiber that it has in the food. And so you can help this person's digestion and everything. Here's another little hint. If they have a lack of a sense of smell, perhaps, one of the things that I think is really important is washing the hands before we eat. That is something that many, many of our older individuals have grown up doing. You're going to come to the table, you're going to wash your hands before you go eat. It's good hygiene anyway. But if we give them a warm cloth and put a drop of lemon on it so that they can smell that lemon, it's a nice tart smell and it goes into that olfactory area, that actually can help to stimulate their desire to eat. And so it's a little bit based on smell, very much so based on sight. And while we're talking about sight and nutrition, let's be very mindful that if you're feeding them on a plate, make sure it is free of patterns. It should be a plain plate. And oftentimes something that's going to contrast well with the food so that they can actually see it, because that can be a big stopper there. If you have chicken and mashed potatoes on a white plate, they may not be able to see it very well. So you want to have a good contrast on there as well. But I have seen people that have dishes with ivy around the edges, and what happens is the person will try to, scrape off that ivy, thinking it's a part of the meal, and it's not actually. So what you serve them on is very important, but how you serve it, make it appealing to the eye, make sure that if they have some sense of taste or sense of smell, that it's going to impact their taste as well. And they're going to impact that nutrition. Very important. So this is just a little picture of what happens when we smell things. And it works with pleasant odors and unpleasant odors, but we have to have the airflow or else it doesn't work very well at all. So if we don't have that taste, it actually impacts quality of life, because when we are sick, people bring us food. When there is a death, people bring us food. When we are happy, we celebrate with food. Food is life for us, and we want to make sure that they have that enjoyment as well, as long as possible, because people with dementia, their tastes are definitely going to change. Be prepared for that. Know what they liked before, and you may have to season things a little bit more, but that sense of taste is actually that taste of life. So now we can talk about hearing. Hearing is really an invisible disability. This is not something that you can see quite readily. Now, most commonly, this is due to a destruction of the inner ear cells, or hair cells. There we go. And that's in that cochlea, that little curlicue area that's in the ear. 71% of all people over age 70 have some type of hearing issue. It is very uncommon to find somebody that doesn't have maybe a little less sensitivity. And this can happen because of our lifestyle. It can be loud noises that we were dealing with all the time with perhaps our job, but it's also part of what's happening in that brain. And the brain is actually where we hear things. It can be impacted, though, by different things, not just dementia. It can be impacted by medications that we take, like some cancer meds are going to happen to hit that olfactory or the hearing center. It can be some antidepressants. How about wax buildup? That's a simple thing. But if we don't get things checked out, sometimes we don't know. And dementia, sometimes they can't tell us. If they are having a problem with hearing, we can go to a qualified audiologist and find out what's going on. Now, we know that the hearing takes place in the brain. That is definitely a scientific proven fact. That sound goes into the ear canal and it goes up into all of those little bones, travels through that cochlea and into the auditory nerve. Well, the auditory nerve is where the brain is now processing what you heard. It's processing the vibrations. If they can't get those vibrations in there, or if the brain is impacted, they're not going to have a good output. And this makes them pretty much unable to communicate well. And this is going to cause distress. It's going to cause distress for them, and it's going to cause distress for you. It makes them not want to be around a lot of people or a lot of loud noises, because it creates more confusion for them. And so they become a little bit more isolated and a little bit more withdrawn. They're reluctant to have even company over. If they have a hearing aid, sometimes it might bother their ear. It's not set in there properly, and they'll fiddle with that. And while we're talking about hearing aids, imagine if you have a hearing aid and you're trying to replace that battery or set the little sound thing that they have on there. I don't understand all of it, and you have vision issues. So that can be an added frustration for them and for you, because sometimes you don't know what they're hearing and what they're not hearing. But dementia, with the increased confusion, it can also increase depression and even anger sometimes. It's based on our approach as well. And so if we are in a situation like that, we're trying to communicate with our loved one, you have to ask yourself, if I couldn't hear, how would I react? And what would I try? Would I try to hide the fact that I can't hear when people are there and they're all talking? Would I take my cues from them and just start laughing when they laugh? Not understanding what happened. And what would my facial expression be if I couldn't hear? Would I lean forward? Would I have a confused look on my face? Would I cup my ear? How would I respond? And how many times would I expect people to repeat themselves before they give up? You see, sometimes what we do, unfortunately, is we talk a little louder, we talk a little harsher, and it comes out as aggression toward them. This is, again, something that they can't help, and we need to be more compassionate. Ask ourselves, how would we want to be treated in that situation? Now, these are the little hairs that I talked about. These are the little hairs that are in that cochlea, and once they are destroyed forever. And it does put this person in a bad situation. So how can we help? We can limit background noise. That's really important. Get their attention before we talk to them. And perhaps if we're talking to them in a normal tone of voice, and our facial expressions are not exaggerated, our gestures are normal and natural, they may be able to pick up on what we're doing. Now, our gestures are very important working with someone who has some hearing issues, because they can sometimes pick up on that gesture, realizing what we want them to do or to take or whatever. But those are things that we can do to help our people who have hearing and dementia along with that. Now, touch is another thing. Brain atrophy impacts our brain in so many different ways, and it does impact how we feel things. And so when our loved one has dementia, they may not recognize hot or cold. And for us, that's not a big deal, but for them, it's a very big deal, because they can dress inappropriately, overheat their bodies, or they can dress inappropriately and be too cold and wind up shivering. Well, we have to keep an eye on them. This is going to happen because of the brain atrophy. It can happen when somebody has a stroke, and there are some other diseases that go along with that as well. Think about diabetes. And actually, while we're saying diabetes, my goodness, there's a diabetes type 3 now, and that is diabetes of the brain. And they are associating that with Alzheimer's disease. So our sugar, our glycemic index is very important to monitor. But how can we help? When somebody has issues that they can't feel as much, well, we can put color codes on things. Red for hot, blue for cold. We can put stickers on the stove or pictures, don't touch. And we can talk to them before we touch them as well to let them know. But also, touch is very important to calm someone down. If we are massaging this area of the hand, we have wonderful pressure points in that hand. And that healing touch, that just being touched and rubbing that area can actually help to stimulate some calmness in that person. The feet are another place where it's wonderful to be touched because of the pressure points. Up the leg to the knee, also great areas of touch. So that's kind of interesting how touch can actually be impacted. But while we're talking about touch, the other thing too is if you're going to touch someone, if you're going to greet them, and if they have dementia, we don't want to pat people. We want to make sure that they know we're there, we're touching them, we're rubbing. That is a move that is going to help, because sometimes that patting can feel like an aggressive move. And if they've lost a lot of weight, it can actually feel a little uncomfortable to them. So rubbing versus, patting. Now we're going to talk about, excuse me, I'm so sorry, need to take a drink. So let's talk about activities. When we're doing any activity, the environment that they're in is extremely, extremely important. They have to feel safe in that environment. It can't be too noisy. It can't be too bright. There are things that are going to impact them negatively when we're trying to do something that's very positive. So the environment is very important. Don't make it overstimulating. But each person with an impairment of some other kind, some sensory impairment, is going to maybe have a different need. So we're going to take them each individually. When we're thinking about persons that have dementia and they're visually impaired, we can do so many adaptations. We can make cards bigger, we can make font bigger, and that really is important. If somebody is having more difficulty reading, make sure that that font is much larger so that they can read it. How about, excuse me, how about some of the games? The more brightly colored the things are, the easier for them to identify them and to maybe sort them or place them appropriately. We want to make sure that if there is some kind of games like dominoes or dice, that we have raised numbers that sometimes are going to be easier for them to feel and relate to. If you're doing anything outside, any gardening, do a raised bed so that they don't have to bend over. It can be closer to their field of vision, especially if they are having dementia issues as well. So there are a lot of things that we can do. Video games are fun, and it's really good for their dexterity as well. So you can have a large screen TV, put a game on there that's a relatively simple game that they can navigate, and whatever it is that we're doing for them, make it stimulating, make it fun, and make it successful for them, because everybody wants to succeed. If we give them something to do as an activity and they can't do it, it's going to soon discourage them, just like it would us. Now, how about hearing impaired activities? Art is a big one. And especially if you have someone that you're taking care of that has dementia, art, it unlocks things in the mind, and it's incredible. And did you know Georgia O'Keeffe painted until she was 96 years old? And so the act of creating, whether it is painting, sketching, sculpting, quilting, no matter what it is, it has an impact on brain health. And they have proven that persons that are more active with their hands and their eyes actually do a lot better in their mind. It creates synapses and you can do fun things with it. So for persons that are hearing impaired, art is a big one. There are recipes for non-toxic paint that you can make at home with gelatin, baking soda, and food coloring. And so if they get it in their mouth or something, it's not going to harm them. So there's lots of ways that we can adapt things. Physical exercise is very important. Not only are we moving things, and you hear that phrase all the time, move it or lose it. How about thinking of it a little bit differently, as in motion is lotion? When we're moving those joints, we're letting that synovial fluid go into that joint, and perhaps we're going to have a lot less problem as far as pain reports or pain expressions from our persons who have any type of sensory loss, but also have dementia. So we want to keep those joints moving. And this is why physical exercise is good. In a group, they kind of catch that fever from one another. And the other thing that happens with physical exercise is we create dopamine in the brain, in that frontal lobe. And while the frontal lobe is being impacted, we can still create some dopamine. It's that feel-good hormone. That's the one we want. So when we're looking at hearing impaired, we want to make sure that the activity, again, if they have profound hearing loss, is something that they can do with the other senses. And remember, your persons with dementia are highly, highly into tactile stimulation. And so tactile stimulation is fun. They like to feel things. Now, if you have a person that you're taking care of or love that had loved to walk in the forest. And I know forest is spelled incorrectly on this slide. I don't know who did that. But anyway, it is spelled incorrectly, and apparently my computer is ridiculous because it didn't catch it and warned me. So if you have someone who likes to walk in the forest or liked to walk in the forest, we can create a little sensory box for them. Maybe put some stones in there, twigs, leaves. How about things that they can smell, like pine needles, so they can smell those pine needles, or a little bit of moss that they can feel. So this is a real good tactile thing for them. If they're into the beach, you can put some sand, you can put some shells, whatever it is that they enjoyed, you can create that stimulation box, that tactile stimulation box for them. It is important, however, that if there's anything that's small, anything that they can put into their mouth, you want to make sure that you are with them the whole time that they're working with this, because we sure don't want anybody to get grit in their eye or anything like that. We can do safer things like carpet samples or fabric samples. We have so many different kinds of fabrics available to us. And balls, we have different sizes, different shapes, different textures. And so that's also a very fun thing for them as well. Excuse me. So there's other things that we can do too. Little bags that are filled with a gel, and they have things in there that they can actually kind of do a treasure hunt. They can feel for the button, they can feel for the marble, different things like that. And again, this is something that you want to be there with them while they're utilizing that, because if that bag ruptures, you sure don't want to have that gel into their face or their mouth. So those are some things with tactile stimulation. And then, of course, late dementia. When we're talking about someone with late dementia, they've lost quite a few of their abilities, and yet they're still there, and they still want to do things. So there was a situation where you could have two people that one loves to unravel sweaters. Well, go get a sweater and let them unravel it. And this other person who may like to roll up the sweater yarn into a ball. You can put those two people together and they can just have a great time. They love to have things that they can touch. So folding, pressing things. If they can't do a whole lot, you know, I would take a basket and say, oh, I'm so overworked today. I need to fold this laundry. Can you help me? And let them fold. And then when you go take that basket of folded things over to another area, unfold everything, bring it back a little while later and ask them to help you again. How about music? Music is so good. And there was a situation that I do have to tell you about because it was actually quite beautiful. Music in the later stages of dementia can still motivate people. If it's music that they were familiar with, like my husband, he loves old time country. And I know to make him happy, that is what I'll play for him. And that'll be fine. I might not enjoy it as much as he does, but there are headphones. And so you can put those on. But there was a little lady, her name was Grace. She was 89 years old, and she hadn't spoken or had really not interacted and communicated for some time. And her son told the minister who was visiting that she loved a song called Precious Savior. And so the minister learned the song. And by the way, he could not sing very well, but he sang to her. And he sang that song each time he went in. And it was shocking because within a month, that lady started singing in her squeaky, high-pitched little voice, Beautiful Savior. And she sang it beautifully, though it was off key. And it was just music to everyone's ears because music moved her. It brought her out. And this is where music is so important. You can actually communicate with music in helping somebody get dressed by saying, I put socks on my feet. I put socks on my feet. So they can sometimes communicate and understand what you're trying to tell them rather than saying, put your socks on your feet. So be creative. It's okay. Nothing is going to be too silly, but make it appropriate for that person. Make sure that you know who they were so that you can make these activities appropriate for who they still are, and honor them. They did not ask for this disease. This is something that none of us said when I'm 10 years old. You know, you say, I want to be a space pilot or a dancer or a singer. No, nobody said, I hope I have dementia and I can't remember how to do things and don't know my loved ones. Said no one ever. And this should motivate us to remember too that we didn't ask for it. And all things happen to us, I believe, for us, not to us. We are given an opportunity to care for and love and stimulate and make this person feel safe and protected and honored throughout their life. And when we go through that with them and we learn these steps to make their life so much better, we actually can help teach others. And we'd love to see that chain of kindness continue. So while you're doing this wonderful act of caring for someone, I do want to thank you for everything that you are doing for them, because you're not just doing it for them, you're doing it for the generation that's watching you to come. Thank you so much. And I hope that this was helpful.